Welcome to the Darwinian Diva podcast. I am Viviana Weeks Shackelford, an evolutionary psychologist and science advocate. Today we are so excited because we have Dr. Lisa Welling with us. And before we say hello to her, let me tell you a little bit about her. Dr. Lisa Welling is a tenured associate professor at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. Previously, Dr. Welling completed an honors thesis on the neurological components of the facial feature hierarchy in the psychology department at St. Thomas University in Canada. And this was funded by an undergraduate student research award. Next, she attended the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, where she completed the requirements for a master's in research and was then transferred to the PhD program. Her PhD, entitled Individual Differences in Face Preferences, was completed in 2008 under the supervision of Dr. Ben Jones in the Face Research Laboratory and was funded by the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. Dr. Welling was then able to secure an Economic and Social Research Council one-year postdoctoral fellowship in the Face Research Laboratory under the supervision of Drs. Ben Jones and Lisa De Bruin. Thereafter, she completed a 3-year American Institute of Bisexuality funded postdoctoral fellowship at the Pennsylvania State University with Dr. David Poots in collaboration with Dr. William Crowley at the University Medical School. Dr. Welling has presented her work at international conferences in various locations around the world, such as Japan, Russia, Italy, and France, and has given invited lectures at prestigious universities such as Harvard University, McMaster University, and University College of London. She joined the faculty at Oakland University in the autumn of 2012, was awarded the Oakland University New Investigator Research Excellence Award in 2015, the Oakland University Outstanding Graduate Mentor Award in 2018, and received tenure in 2017. In addition to having published more than 70 journal articles, she has produced 2 edited volumes, one entitled Evolutionary Perspectives on Social Psychology and the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology and Behavioral Endocrinology. She also currently serves on the editorial boards for the journals of Archives of Sexual Behavior, Evolutionary Psychological Science, and Adaptive Human Behavior and Physiology, and is an associate editor for Evolutionary Psychology. She is particularly interested in how hormones affect different aspects of our behavior, including mate choice, mate preferences, and sexual behavior. Okay, so we have Dr. Lisa Welling with us. So welcome on the Darwinian Diva podcast. Thanks for being on here today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we are going to talk first about how it's been for you as an academic in, I hate saying quarantine, but it is sort of, or was, and how has it impacted you? So just like a couple of episodes ago, I talked to Dr. Martha Escobar, and we talked about how the stay-at-home order has affected her and how it's impacted her academic life. So at least one of the things that she talked about in terms of recommendations or strategies for, how to cope and deal with academic duties and maintain those, high standards is to having a calendar. So making sure that you have everything, in order, and it's just very helpful to do that. I know with me, I love having a calendar and all, but for myself, I find it difficult to get to the calendar, to remember to put it on there. And then once I do put it on there, I still have to have a voice reminder, to help me follow through with those kinds of things. And I still miss about 10 to 15% of things. So what can you add to that in terms of, how this has impacted your academic life?
I completely agree with Martha on the calendar aspect, 100%. With what I've found is there's considerably more juggling. There's no childcare, obviously. And I have a young son, so that's been very challenging. And that leads to more work in the evenings and weekends, obviously less time with my husband, and absolutely scheduling. Even things like this conversation, I had to make sure that my husband was available to kind of take over. So he meets with clients and is considered an essential employee. So we're having to schedule basically everything right down to, the minute, if so or so it feels. So yeah, I'm absolutely on board with the scheduling aspect, having a calendar. We have a shared family calendar where both of our schedules are included. And I do get those little ping reminders on my phone 10 minutes before anything's supposed to happen to make sure that I keep on schedule. And that's really helped a lot with us.
So just a quick question then. So is one of you better than the other at maintaining the calendar? Like
Oh,
Todd
I'm
is,
totally better at the calendar.
He's the master calendar person. I'm really bad with keeping track of things. And I just feel like it's another duty. It's another thing that I have to do.
It is. It's definitely one other thing that kind of adds to it. I agree with that. But for me, it's the best way to not let things fall by the wayside. Even things like editing student papers, I will put in my calendar and mark off specific time for that. And obviously there's going to be, if at all possible, some flexibility. But when you flexibly move tasks to later in the evening, that means less focus time with the family. So there's definitely, like I said before, a juggling act. And yeah, I'm the queen of calendars. I love having calendars and to-do lists, actually. I love both. And I have a variety of each of those things. But absolutely, in my relationship, I'm certainly the one that's better with the calendar.
That's hilarious. So you mentioned, parenting and the juggling act. And can you think of one or two ways where it really has impacted your parenting as well?
You're both more present and less focused at the same time. So because you're constantly trying to juggle, you do get more time with your children, which is great. I'm loving the extra time with my son. But every spare little minute, you're trying to check your email and quickly tick off, I'll quickly send this reply, I'll quickly review this IRB, things like that, getting all those little tasks done as much as possible while you're also dealing with childcare issues. So that juggling means you're around more often, but not necessarily as focused or engaged with your children. And so that can be a bit of a struggle. So that juggling, I know I keep using the word juggling, but that's really how it feels. I guess another way in which it's kind of impacted work is that, of course, all in-person work has stopped. So we're only collecting some data at the moment. All of that we're collecting is online. We can't even run hormonal assays at the moment. So everything's been moved to these remote kind of techniques.
Right. And so you're also managing graduate students as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so they can't go into campus or anything like that to collect data?
No, so we've been having lab meetings completely remotely. We've been doing it via Google Meet and phone and things like that. So that's how I've been meeting with all my grad students since March.
So your son also, he probably loves this. He gets a lot of mommy time.
Yeah, at first I think it was a bit of an adjustment when he left daycare, when it closed. So he did struggle with that at the start, I think. And I think that was just because of the change in routine. He's 2, so routine is just paramount for him. And once he kind of adjusted to me being home and him being home all the time, he's kind of loving it.
Yeah. There is that period of adjustment. I feel this, very similar in that it took, I don't know, for me about a month to sort of adjust and let go that, okay, well, I have no control of anything.
Yeah.
And, but then once that passed, there was like this, I don't know, controlled chaotic schedule that we had.
Controlled chaos is a great way to put it.
So did you have to do any sort of remote learning or anything like that? Did he have like a continuation of things that he was doing in daycare or no?
A little bit, nothing too taxing. They had just some online activities that they would do every day. So just little things for things like fine motor development and for him, it's mostly just play-related activities, but like learning how to draw lines and things that are developmentally appropriate. Nothing too crazy. There was just a 10 a.m. and a 2 p.m. little short meeting, basically online.
With the class?
It wasn't even, he wasn't actually online. It was just these little videos that they would post. So they were technically optional, but they were encouraging us to do that since he's going to be starting preschool next year. They'd him to keep on top of things.
little Zoom meetings for toddlers.
I know. Academic starts early.
All right. So we've talked a little bit about how things have impacted our lives, right? Just very broadly. So I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about things and that are, floating around in our body that impact our psychology and our behavior. So one of your main areas of research focuses on hormones and relationships or interactions, how they interact with relationships and attraction. Um, so this is kind of strange here. So if I walked up to you on the side of the road, maybe not on the side of the road, but like if I had on a mask too, right? At the grocery store, maybe at a park, and we were talking about kids and talking about jobs, and I asked, okay, so what do you do, and how is it related to behavioral endocrinology? What would you say?
Well, so first, I guess I should talk about what behavioral endocrinology is. So behavioral endocrinology is the scientific study of how hormones impact behavior. And it's an interdisciplinary field. It has experts across various specialties like psychology, obviously, but also anthropology, neurology, medicine, zoology, and several others. So my work within this area mainly focuses on how steroid hormones impact human mating behavior and human preferences.
Oh, okay. So then what about like if you're thinking about your approach to studying endocrinology, um, a lot of psychologists would traditionally characterize themselves as either, cognitive psychologist, developmental. How would you characterize your approach to this behavioral endocrinology?
Well, when I investigate questions pertinent to behavioral endocrinology, I do take an evolutionary perspective. So I'm interested in how hormones have evolved to be these proximate mechanisms to increase likelihood of certain behaviors occurring under specific circumstances. So why do they encourage certain behaviors in some situations and other behaviors under other circumstances, for example? So I'm just been interested in how these chemical messengers really shape, because that's what hormones are. They're these tiny little chemical messengers that float throughout our bodies and impact a variety of things. Obviously, people tend to think of biological aspects, things like the menstrual cycle and pregnancy and so forth, but they also influence in a lot of ways how you feel, how you conduct yourself. And so that's really what I'm interested in looking at, is how an evolutionary perspective can help explain those interactions between hormones and behavior.
Okay, so you're using an evolutionary perspective. So what other approaches, like, so what's a good comparison? So an evolutionary perspective focuses on, like ultimate sort of explanations, right? And so you're looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, but how does other perspectives, approach something like the study of hormones?
Well, some take more bio. I mean, everything really, from my perspective, everything really does boil down to proximate versus ultimate mechanisms. So most individuals, for which I'm familiar anyway, tend to take on board at least elements of an evolutionary approach when making inferences about their data. Certainly, there are individuals who study behavioral endocrinology who view themselves as social psychologists, for instance, and don't necessarily see the evolutionary perspective as paramount. But even then, when you continuously ask the why questions, like, well, this happens because of X, Y, Z, well, why? Because of X, Y, Z, well, why? Because of X, Y, Z. As you kind of delve back and peel back layers, eventually it comes down to an evolutionary explanation is what tends to make sense. At least that's my perspective on it. But certainly there are those who take more of a social approach, and there are people who take more of a strictly medical approach.
Okay. So you alluded to like what, people think when they hear the word hormones. So my thinking was that, maybe people think about menstrual cycle or testosterone when they hear the word hormones. And I actually asked a few people, what are the three, things that first come to mind when I say the words hormones? And I've got things from testosterone, teenagers, sex, and
Most
change.
people think I study PMS.
Well,
That's
yeah,
usually what I hear.
right. There's that. but this one is really funny. This is changing, challenging, crying. So I thought
Oh
that was
dear.
that's um, menstrual cycle, yeah, and mood swings. But so clearly, right, the world of hormones is enormous. Complex, and it starts in utero and takes off from there with peaks during puberty and menopause. I'm sure there's quite a few other peaks, and clearly there are many other areas of our lives where these hormones take place and play an important role, and also it provides fruitful areas of research. So one area that I think is really interesting and is mate attraction relationships. So just given your experience and your research, how do the role of hormones play a role in in mate attraction?
Well, most work looking at mate attraction has primarily been done on females and mostly looking at three components of attraction. It tends to get broken down this way. So three components being attractivity, proceptivity, and receptivity. So what does that mean? Attractivity is referring to the stimulus value of an individual for a given potential partner. So how attractive they are. And most research across different species finds that in females, this is generally enhanced by estrogens, in mammals at least. Proceptivity refers to the extent to which an individual initiates copulation. So it's their overt behavior that reflects underlying libido, so their sex drive. Research tends to find that this is facilitated again by estrogen. I'll sometimes say estrogen, sometimes I'll say estradiol. In humans, the dominant estrogen is estradiol, just FYI. Estrogen is technically a class of hormone. So an all-female mammal study to date, as far as I'm aware, proceptivity, so overt behavior reflecting their underlying sex drive, seems to be influenced, at least in part, by estrogens, although testosterone seems to be important in both women and men's sexual motivation, particularly for women and humans. And then the third component that I haven't mentioned yet is receptivity. Receptivity is the extent of the response an individual has to sexual initiation from a potential partner. So how they respond to someone else trying to initiate sex with them. And again, estrogen seems to be important. This has been studied in women, also rabbits and rhesus macaques. And in those three species, for example, they were all found that females were maximally sensitive to stimulation, like tactile stimulation, and so forth, when their estrogen was higher. And you can see that from those components that proceptivity and receptivity certainly do overlap conceptually. So if you look at the animal literature, for example, oftentimes they'll use lordosis posture to indicate both of those things. So lordosis posture, you see it in cats and you see it in rats. It's when the female is sexually receptive, and so she arches her back to give the male better access to her genitals. So hormones affect all three of these components for sure in a variety of species, but in females, estradiol seems to be particularly important. So in human females specifically, you see these estrus-like changes that occur around peak fertility, so around the time a woman ovulates, in all three of these components. So for example, women are more attractive to males near peak fertility when they're around ovulation, which may be driven by increases in estrogens, or it could be something like their estrogen to progesterone ratio. Right before a woman ovulates, her estrogen is high compared to progesterone, whereas after ovulation, her progesterone is high compared to her estrogen. And so that ratio may play an important role in women being more attractive to potential partners. Women also seek out males more when they're maximally fertile, so near ovulation, and evidence suggests that might be modulated by women's testosterone level. And also, women report initiating sex more often. They have more sexual fantasies, and they even report having better sexual experiences, like more orgasms when they're near peak fertility versus other times. So researchers have found evidence, in other words, that estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, or a combination of these hormones may be responsible for mate attraction, or at least may facilitate mate attraction in a variety of contexts.
So I'm blown away by that. The fact that not that I guess what you sort of hinted at was something like, an estrus type presentation by females. Um, and and it's not just, a physical presentation, but there's actually the hormonal changes that you can follow, right? Is that how the research is done, where it's over time or something like that?
A lot of the research tends to look at the menstrual cycle because there
Okay.
are relatively predictable fluctuations in these three hormones across the menstrual cycle. So they may look at, they may test the same participants multiple times. That's what's encouraged, is using within subject design for sure.
Okay.
So they may look at women around the time when they're maximally fertile. They can use a variety of counting estimates to try and figure out approximately when they would be ovulating. And they may look at the same women again after ovulation when they're in what's called the mid-luteal phase. So that's just a term referring to the second phase of the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle, first you have menstruation, and that's the start of what's called the follicular phase, which is so named because it's when the follicle is developing to be released at ovulation. And the follicular phase ends with ovulation occurring, and thereafter you have what's called the luteal phase, which ends with the start of the next menstruation. So usually you have researchers follow women over one or more menstrual cycles, perhaps testing them once a week over several weeks, or sometimes they will purposely try and schedule them at specific times in the menstrual cycle.
So you mentioned that men find women, or at least the research suggests that men find women more attractive during their luteal phase, where they're
No, late follicular
oh,
phase,
late
actually.
follicular phase.
Yeah,
Okay.
late follicular is right before ovulation occurs.
Okay.
And so that's when sex is most likely to result in conception.
Okay. All right. So what is it that men, or what does the research say, that men see in why they think a woman is attractive during that time? Like what is it that they're seeing?
Well, it's a difficult question because the changes seem to be very subtle.
Okay.
So, for example, some research suggests that there are changes in facial coloration across the menstrual cycle, where there's more redness in the skin tone near peak fertility versus other times. But other research finds that those changes are too subtle to be consciously perceived by male partners. So it seems to be some kind of an unconscious mechanism, at least in some respects. But men certainly do seem, according to several studies, seem to find women more attractive in several modalities at peak fertility versus other times. So they find that women smell more attractive at that time. They rate their faces as more attractive, and they even rate their voices as sounding more attractive at peak fertility versus the same women tested at other points in their menstrual cycles.
That's that's really cool. And so do other women find other women attractive as well, during peak fertility, or are there fluctuations? I mean, is it seen universally, or, like across sexes, or no?
You tend to see some derogation of competitors at peak fertility when you're looking at women across their own menstrual cycles. So what you
Okay.
tend to see, according to a few studies anyway, is that women tend to downplay the attractiveness of potential competitors, potential romantic rivals, so other women, when they're maximally fertile versus other times. So you don't exactly see the same thing.
Right, right. All right.
You do see among lesbian couples, however, that women who are near peak fertility will still initiate sex more often with their female partners. So it's not all about male attention. It's also about underlying female psychology.
Right, which might be motivated by hormones as well, right?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, right. Um, all right, so we're still talking about relationships and the role of hormones here. So one of the comments, or at least one of the things that pop into people's mind when I say hormones, is sex. And so with that, what would you say are the primary roles of hormones during female orgasm?
So there's two hormones that are very important for women's sexual behavior and experience, and those are estradiol or estrogen and testosterone. So estrogen is important for female sexual function, and that includes things like sufficient vaginal lubrication and so forth. And it's also correlated with reports of stronger sensations during orgasm in women. So it's definitely important for their sexual experiences in that regard. Testosterone, on the other hand, is correlated with reports of relaxing orgasm experiences and seems to be critical for women's general sexual motivation, for their sex drive. Both testosterone and sex drive are highest near ovulation. Low testosterone causes low sex drive. It's very well documented in the medical community. And testosterone treatment restores low sex drive. Also, testosterone, but not estrogen or progesterone, correlates with sexual desire, sexual thoughts, and anticipation of sex. So I guess in summary, estrogen seems to influence sensation and testosterone seems to influence motivation, but both are very important for female sexual experience and female orgasm.
So would you say there is a functional component? So, you mentioned pleasure and sensation and so forth. But would you say, I don't know, like from an evolutionary perspective, or for that matter, any of the psychological perspectives, is there any suggestion of a function of female orgasm outside of, it feels great?
Well, I mean, I think we shouldn't overlook the fact that female orgasm feels great. I think that in of itself serves a function.
Right.
It increases women's sexual desire. It increases their motivation to engage in sexual behavior, which is obviously very adaptive. Because if sex feels great and you want to do it, you're more likely to reproduce, and that helps propagate your genetic line and so forth. So yeah, I think we shouldn't overlook that as in and of itself just a very important mechanism, a very adaptive mechanism for increasing sexual behavior. But there's other evidence behind this idea of what is the function of female orgasm. Some people suggest that it may function in pair bonding type of situations. So when you orgasm, one of the hormones that tends to kind of flood the system is oxytocin. Sometimes people refer to oxytocin as kind of like a cute cuddle hormone or love hormone.
Mm-hmm.
And they refer to it as such because it does increase when you're around those that you love, that you're affectionate towards, and also increases at, like I said, orgasm, as well as childbirth and breastfeeding. So oxytocin is very important for that, and seems to be related to pair bonding experiences, not just in humans, but also in other in monogamous species like prairie voles and things like that. So if your oxytocin goes up at orgasm, it may increase your drive to bond with your partner, both the woman and for the male. And another potential adaptive explanation for the function of female orgasm is some evidence suggests it actually helps with conception. It actually helps draw the sperm further up into the female reproductive tract and direct the sperm, potentially anyway, according to some research, towards the fallopian tube of the ovary that will be releasing an egg in that particular cycle. So yeah, it seems to also serve that function.
Okay, so you mentioned that breastfeeding and oxytocin, and that sort of feel-good cuddle component. So how is oxytocin related to breastfeeding?
So oxytocin is responsible for what's called the milk letdown reflex. So in breastfeeding, you've got two primary hormones that are responsible. You've got prolactin. Prolactin is so named because prolactational.
Right.
And prolactin is necessary for breast milk development. But when the infant suckles on the breast, it actually triggers the release of oxytocin, which then triggers the milk letdown reflex, which is how you actually feed the infant. So that's how oxytocin is involved there.
So when you were talking earlier about, the different hormones being activated during like orgasm, for example, it made me think about, what comes first. Is it the hormones, or is it, just seeing someone? And it just popped back into my mind because we were talking about breastfeeding, and when women hear that, who are lactating, they hear like a baby's cry, or they just see their child, sometimes that activates the lactation. So it made me come back to that, what comes first kind of thing.
Well, it's certainly a lot of research points to this bidirectional relationship. So it can be either way. You can have hormones impacting behavior, but you can also have behavior impacting hormones, no question. So the examples that you gave are good examples of that. Seeing your child can cause a flood of oxytocin, and that can accidentally trigger the milk letdown reflex, particularly earlier on when you're still kind of learning to breastfeed, early after you've given birth. Same thing with hearing another infant cry, even if it's not your own, that can also trigger the milk letdown reflex. So yeah, behavior can cause hormonal changes, and hormonal changes can influence behavior.
So talking about hormones influencing behavior, we often think about contraception and, hormone therapy. So in as a form of birth control or easing symptoms of menopause. I mean, there may be underlying medical issues for why that might be the case as well. So of course, like with any medication, there are side effects and so forth of, doing these kinds of things. But so one, aspect, or I guess one area of concern in study is looking at the, medical sort of side effects of these things. But can you speak to what might be some psychological side effects of, for taking either hormonal birth control or for, perimenopausal and menopausal women, hormone therapy?
Well, there are several psychological side effects that have been documented, but I would like to say first that I'm very pro hormonal contraceptives in general. Although, they have given women an unprecedented level of control over their own reproductive choices, and I don't think that should be overlooked.
Right.
So that has led to greater inclusion in the workplace and other areas of society. But that said, I do think it does women a disservice not to investigate all of the potential side effects of these synthetic hormones. And that includes the psychological and emotional side effects of hormonal contraceptives. So it is only through thorough investigation that we can allow women to make fully informed decisions about their reproductive health and develop new treatments that deal with any of these potential. So most work on hormonal contraceptives focuses on the physical side effects, and those have been well documented for some time. So things like the treatment of dysfunctional uterine bleeding, the elimination of functional ovarian cysts, so it can have some very positive side effects, reduced cramping, reduced acne. There can also be some negative side effects. Sleep disruption is sometimes reported, or increased risk of blood clots and stroke, of course. But like the physical side effects, more recent research has found both positive and negative psychological impacts of hormonal contraceptive use. Contraceptive users report less variability in their mood across the cycle. And for those who have, perimenopausal syndrome related issues, that can be quite a benefit. They also, some individuals report improved perception of their quality of life. This seems to particularly be among those using low dose hormonal contraceptives. But on the flip side, you can also see reported negative effects on mood and well-being, such as an increase in borderline personality disorder symptoms among those who are diagnosed with the disorder. So hormonal contraceptive users also report higher rates of depression compared to non-users. Hormonal contraceptive users report more interest in short-term sexual encounters, but paradoxically have lower on average sex drives compared to non-users. And there's also evidence that hormonal contraceptives are related to higher jealousy towards a partner and their behavior, increased effective response to hypothetical infidelity scenarios, and even higher mate guarding. So you are more likely to keep closer tabs on your partner when using hormonal contraceptives versus women who are not using hormonal contraceptives. So research in this area is ongoing, and a lot certainly remains to be investigated.
So do you think, I don't know if there's research on this, but do you think that, so with those heightened, psychological effects, so more jealousy or increased symptoms of personality disorders, do you think that it's just exacerbated, or so I guess I'm asking, is there research sort of, pre and post taking birth control, and to what extent is it just personality, or is it actually the hormones that are causing the uptick in those psychological effects?
I think that's a really good question, because there is a lot more research that needs to be done, especially longitudinal research. There's very little that's currently out there looking at the longitudinal influence of hormonal contraceptive initiation versus cessation, and how that impacts behavior. Certainly, with for example, the borderline personality disorder study that I mentioned, they were investigating that within women who were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and found an increase in symptoms. So the severity of the symptoms increased. So it's kind of exacerbating the pre-existing issue in that particular case. Otherwise, I mean, there's been some research longitudinally looking at the potential impact on mate choice, for instance, but not very much. Only a handful of studies so far have looked at that. And we definitely do need more. So it is possible, absolutely, that there are confounds present. It's certainly possible that women who choose to use hormonal contraceptives differ in some substantial or important ways for these particular questions from women who choose not to use hormonal contraceptives. So, for instance, there are some noted differences in personality. So, I'll make sure I get this in the right direction. There's definitely a difference in extroversion, for instance. I remember reading the study, but I can't remember the direction. I think it was that women who use hormonal contraceptives on average were less extroverted than women who don't use hormonal contraceptives, but I could be mistaken on that. That's off the top of my head. Yeah. So there's certainly, anyway, I just use that as an example. It's certainly possible that there are differences there, pre-existing differences. And most commonly in the research, what you do see is a comparison across groups. So we do need more longitudinal research.
Yeah. The one thing that just made me think of as well is, so teenage, females who go on birth control, whether it's for sex or for cramping and things like that, the importance of looking at the sort of, side effects, whether it's physiological side effects of starting, really early. Just speaking to how important it is, to investigate all of the negative side effects, whether they're psychological or physiological, because there may be developmental sort of consequences, because as a younger teenager, their brain is still developing, right?
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any research that suggests there's any kind of long-term developmental impacts of hormonal contraceptives on teenagers. So the general consensus is that they're by and large safe to use, particularly now. The first hormonal contraceptive that was ever introduced was called Enovid, and it's no longer on the market because it was such a high dose of synthetic estrogen. It was associated with a drastic increase in likelihood of dying from a blood clot related diagnosis. So they've since kind of tapered that down considerably. And generally the consensus is that unless you have pre-existing conditions such as clotting disorders, that for the most part, hormonal contraceptives are considered safe to use, even at relatively young ages. In fact, most often when they're prescribed, particularly when they're prescribed to teenagers, it's because of menstrual-related issues. So usually, pain during menstruation, so severe cramping, and sometimes the changes in negative affect across the cycle. So not all women experience changes in mood across the cycle, but among some women who have perimenstrual-related issues, sometimes those mood changes, the irritability can be quite severe. And so so there are those positive side effects, like I mentioned, women who then go on hormonal contraceptives to regulate their cycles report an increase in feelings of well-being because they no longer feel those strong increases in irritability across the cycle.
So what do you think are like two implications for your specific research on hormones?
Two implications. Well, humans tend to think. I'll just kind of like spitball here for a second, I guess. Humans, I guess, we tend to think of ourselves as kind of above or outside the animal kingdom, which of course is not true. It's not controversial, for instance, to talk about how hormones impact behavior in, say, dogs, cats, or even chimpanzees, despite them being our closest relatives. But people tend to assume that humans are different for some reason. And one thing I like about behavioral endocrinology is that it provides a bit of a reality check in that regard by showing how we are all biopsychosocial beings who are also influenced by our own biology in these ways. So hormones aren't just pregnancy or PMS, but rather they can impact a variety of social.
Right. So, sorry, so does an evolutionary psychological approach make that easier for you to think about behavioral endocrinology? So what I'm getting at here is, if we think about just a social, psychological perspective, um, does it, because an evolutionary perspective, cuts across, comparatively, across disciplines, does it make it easier for you to, sort of approach this topic?
It like I said before, I see evolutionary psychology from my own research as kind of an explanatory framework. It's the
Yeah.
way I make sense of the data. So it helps approach questions because of pre-existing theories that come up in light of evolutionary psychology and evolutionary perspectives. They're very testable potential theories and hypotheses that you can then move forward with. So I guess it helps me in that regard, how I interpret things and how I move forward with making further hypotheses. And I do think I like that you pointed out the comparative work, because I think that's really important. A lot of the stuff I've been talking about, they have actually found in non-human primates as well,
Okay.
including some of the stuff I was mentioning about hormonal contraceptives and changes in attractive ratings and things of that nature. They do also tend to see those same sorts of responses in other non-human primates, be they chimpanzees, the gorillas. They've looked at crab-eating macaques, rhesus macaques, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's really fascinating that we do see that commonality across our species, but also across other primate species.
All right. So do you have any fun upcoming research that you're looking forward to in your lab?
I'm looking forward to this being over so we can really get back to the lab. That's for sure. We do have a lot going on right now, despite the stay-at-home order.
Yeah.
One series of projects that I'm excited about involves how the relative dose of different progestins found in hormonal contraceptives predicts changes in partner-related behavior. So we're also, and we're looking into these questions both within and between subjects, so stay tuned on that. But we're also looking at a variety of in-person studies once the stay-at-home order is lifted and everyone's safe to resume research. Or we're looking at things like how hormones predict online dating behavior, for example, and things like that. But yeah, stay tuned.
That's awesome. Okay, well, Dr. Lisa Welling, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate your time. I know it's a crazy time.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
And if our viewers would like to reach out to you, or if they have any further questions, how should they reach out to you?
Well, you can reach me by email. My email is welling@oakland.edu. So that's WELLING at oakland.edu. You can get copies of my publications and other information on my lab at my website, which is wellingresearchlab.com. So Welling Research Lab is all one word, of course. And you can also follow us on Facebook, so the Welling Research Lab, or on Twitter, the handle for the lab, Lab Welling.
All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
A big thank you to you guys for listening today. Please continue to send in your questions and comments. We really like receiving them. And remember, be curious, stay engaged, and join us next time on the Darwinian Diva podcast.